Perfect.
Yes. So we have a little bit more time, and hopefully we can do more Q&A in this first session this morning. First part of the session, we will hear from 4 panelists here. I'll introduce them in a minute in the room. And then after that, we'll open the floor for more of a roundtable where other countries may want to add to the discussion. And since we have a bit more time, I propose that after each presenter, we will have a very quick short Q&A specifically to the presentation before we move to the next one. So I'm very happy to introduce Karim Marshall. She's a senior advisor in the United States Environmental Protection Agency to hear about the case from the US. And then after that, we'll have Dominique Jade Espejo. She's professor of environmental law. Yeah, on my left. And Universidad Diego Portales de Chile. And then after that, we will hear from Peter Luque. He's the Chief Director, Environmental Knowledge and Information in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment in South Africa. And then the 4th panelist will be Franziska Wolf. She's the Head of Division for Sustainability and Social Aspects of Environmental Policy from the Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection from Germany. So we'll go in this order, and then let us get started with US from Karim. You have 15 minutes. Please, you have the floor.
So I won't be using the full 15 minutes, so hopefully we can have a robust discussion afterwards. My name is Karim Marshall. I am the inaugural senior advisor for the newly created Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And on behalf of the Biden administration, Administrator Regan, and the thousands of dedicated environmental employees at the U.S. EPA, I bring you greetings and gratitude for this conference. So I'm going to present on some of the U.S. approaches to environmental justice. There are several, but in the interest of time and facilitating a robust discussion, I've limited myself to 3 examples. It's my hope that this will, along with my remarks and the conversation that's provided by the other panelists, provide for a robust exchange of ideas, because we are looking to share information as much as take some information back to the US. So hopefully we can learn from some of the practices at the other member jurisdictions. So again, I'm going to go through 3 of the many iterations and initiatives that the administration has put in place for environmental justice as far as our ongoing efforts. Now, just as a recap, this administration has prioritized environmental justice as one of the core pillars of the aspect of the Environmental Protection Agency. And our goal is to incorporate EJ principles into EPA regulatory actions, our permitting, and our enforcement activities. We want to elevate environmental justice by creating a national office, and that's the office that I'm here representing along with the agency as a whole. And as you are all aware, Administrator Regan presented at the 2022 ministerial and has treated this as a huge priority, not just for the EPA as an individual agency, but for the US government as a whole, and particularly in our multilateral and bilateral efforts internationally. Now, the thing that's unique about the US government is because of our federal system, we have to look at our environmental justice efforts not just through the lens of how do we work as a single national government, but we have a sense of cooperative federalism. The individual 50 states are also sovereign, so we work with them as opposed to directing their efforts. So that creates for some interesting opportunities to find new synergies. So the first initiative I'm going to talk about is the United States Justice 40 initiative. Now, this was triggered by Section 223 of Executive Order 14008. And simplified, it means that 40% of federal expenditures should go towards prioritizing disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. Now, the mere definition of what is a disadvantaged, marginalized, underserved, or overburdened community has been a learning opportunity for our administration. We have had numerous discussions and interchanges with affected communities about how the lack of previous investments have affected each of these neighborhoods and each of these communities. And the work itself has been an exercise in identifying what is a benefit. So it is really easy, relatively simple for us to look at the federal budget, identify 40% of it, and say 40% of those benefits should go to communities that have been previously marginalized. However, the term benefit was intentionally used. So we're not charged to just look at the amount of expenditures. We're also supposed to identify and quantify the benefits that are flowing to these communities. So it's not just about how much we spend in allocating funding for new pipes in Flint. It's about what are the aggregate benefits that can be attributed to that expenditure. And the great thing is that in a lot of instances, we've been able to meet or exceed 40% merely because the identification of benefits is a more holistic approach and examination of the analysis. Now, this presentation is also supposed to be about lessons learned. And one of the key lessons learned, and you will see this as a trend throughout, but one of the key lessons learned specifically when it comes to investment in communities is that ensuring community input and community identification of the projects and the investments that they want to prioritize has been a huge benefit because the communities are more equipped to be able to identify usage patterns, actual impact, and ground truth a lot of the investments that we are contemplating so that when we're making a decision on where to best direct investments, we're reflecting the priorities of communities. Now, this initiative is called the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program. And the idea here is that the federal government is, at least the US federal government, is a rather large bureaucratic enterprise. And in order to access some of the resources that we have as standing resources, the vast majority of our investments into states and communities take the form of grants. So there's an application process and a compliance process that goes along with that. So the idea behind the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers is that we are capacity building in communities. And what does capacity building mean? That in and of itself is a discussion as well, but being able to identify what strengths or weaknesses exist in a community. Why do certain communities not apply for federal opportunities? How do we encourage them not just to apply for, but to successfully steward any federal opportunities that are provided to them so that they aren't at the risk of an audit or they're not at the risk of any negative consequences from accidentally or inadvertently mismanaging the funds that are a public trust? So the biggest lesson learned in this is the ability to raise awareness of resources. You would be surprised the degree to which communities that could directly benefit from federal opportunities are not even aware that these federal opportunities exist. So we use these tic tacs not just to strengthen the ability of these communities to apply for, receive, and responsibly manage, but also to raise awareness of the investments that we're making available for many of these communities. Now, this is a novel approach. We developed 16 tic tacs throughout the country. Some of them have a regional focus, and they are structured in various different ways in each of the region that are supposed to be responsive to the needs of those areas. But the idea is that there are responsive, local, trusted advisors in each of the communities that the community trusts, that they're willing to go to for advice and to learn from so that they can operate independently and be able to continue to seek out those federal opportunities. And then third, this one is a combination of a new initiative and an existing initiative. The federal government has a feedback mechanism called federal advisory committees, and they're governed by a statute that sort of brackets the ways in which they get together, the way in which we receive information from them, and the ability for them to get information from other constituent groups. But they provide a very useful conduit for information and feedback from the community to experts to the federal government. And there's two that are relevant in the environmental justice space. There's a legacy one that has existed for more than 30 years, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And that one was established to advise the administrator at EPA. That one still exists. That one is very robust. It is fully staffed. It is very representative. And the new one is the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And their ambit is larger. They are responsible for advising the White House in the implementation of environmental justice priorities across the federal government. Now, EPA staffs both of these. So practically, there's a high degree of interaction between the NEJAC, which is the legacy one, and the WEJAC, the White House one, which is the new federal one. But at its base, the Federal Advisory Committee is an excellent venue within the US federal government to be able to identify interested expert or representative parties that can bring information from their communities or from their degree of expertise back to the agency or entity that hosts them, and we can incorporate that into decision making. Very often, the decision making process in which we enlist them is iterative. We will issue them a question called a charge. They will come back with recommendations and questions for us. Sometimes very often, they give us homework and we are required to do research, respond to their questions, and justify our existing policies or policies under development in response to those questions. For any other countries that are looking to emulate this model, one of the things that we've learned from the longstanding NEJAC is the importance of providing structure but flexibility, providing a predictable meeting structure, providing opportunities for the members of the committees to get to know each other, to build trust amongst each other, and also to understand that if you are adding communities to your federal advisory committees that may have been previously marginalized, the building of trust between you and those committees is a long-term iterative process. And it takes a while for them to be able to trust you enough to be honest with you. So understand this isn't one of those instances like our speaker yesterday from New Zealand was able to say, it's not just about putting them in the room, it's about putting them in a room in a way that's meaningful and allows them to have meaningful input and to feel like, even if the resolution isn't 100% of what they want, to feel like they were treated as meaningful participants in the process. So, so what you have before you is a picture of our administrator at the previous ministerial, and our priorities reflect the priorities of this conference. And it's made clear that governments across the world increasingly recognize the importance of considering and advancing environmental justice within their respective jurisdictions. We're excited for the opportunity to exchange information and ideas and lessons learned as peer members of the OECD. It's also highlighted that consideration of populations in vulnerable situations is critical to ensuring equitable environmental and human health outcomes within our respective jurisdictions. In 22, we chaired the OECD Environment Ministerial, where our environmental ministers committed to a goal of improving equity and equality, fairness, inclusiveness, citizens' awareness, and their meaningful engagement. We applaud OECD's efforts, culminating in this conference, on advancing national policies to address environmental justice domestically and the launch of the National Approaches to Environmental Justice report. As we look forward to the next biennium, under our 5-year environment ministerial mandate, the question becomes, what will OECD do next in this vital space on promoting environmental justice? The report found that most OECD member countries address some aspect of EJ, but key gaps remain. And these include comprehensive national plans or policies that explicitly address EJ. And again, we're not particularly tied to the term EJ. We know that there's some differences within countries on how you refer to it. It's more about the principles. Consideration of disproportionate impacts in policy decisions, availability of data required for applying an environmental justice lens to the analysis of differentiated impacts of policies, and additional tools and approaches to improve meaningful involvement of hard-to-reach communities. OECD can help through further assessment or development of a series of case studies in various countries on ways that national policies evaluate and implement EJ concepts with the view of identifying and highlighting best practices that we can all learn from. OECD can also conduct an analysis on methodologies and best practices for considering cumulative impacts and challenges and methodologies for assessing the impact of national policies on concentrations, exposure, risk, and/or health impacts at a local level. Finally, to promote EJ across OECD member countries and accession countries, OECD could explore the development of an OECD recommendation on national approaches to environmental justice and meaningful public participation, building off the key concepts identified in this report. I'm excited to open for questions, and I'm really looking forward to the exchange of ideas between ourselves and our member countries and the other panelists. I look forward to your questions. So I'm here at your disposal, and thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Karim, on sharing with us how it's set up at the federal, state, and how to connect to the local level in the United States, and also for some suggestions for further follow-up work. Just to note that after this session, I think we're going to have a dedicated discussion on what can we do next. And it's important for those participants who may not be aware, this conference is followed immediately by Environmental Policy Committee of the OECD, where we will be discussing exactly that, what's going to be our program of work in 25 and 26. So what you're going to contribute in the next few hours is going to be a very important input to that discussion that happens starting this afternoon and to the end of the week. Okay, so the floor is open if you would like to pose any questions to Karim. Nobody wants to be the first? Yes. Canada, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Just a question on how you measure results and the impact of the work, especially in the Justice 40. So I don't want to go too detailed in a question, but I think understanding the results is important and how you're measuring that.
So with Justice 40, it's an evolving mechanism. I think, so what we started with was identifying a baseline of expenditures, being able to say this for each of the covered J40 programs. And again, I know I'm probably going to say this several times, but the US federal government is massive. And when you think about the number just of covered programs, like that was the first thing that we had to identify is which programs are actually eligible to be included in the benchmark for the 40%. So just with EPA, we have nearly 80 covered programs. And being able to identify that these programs have expenditures in these spaces, this is the baseline expenditure, and then what is actually directable within that general pool of expenditures, plus anything that may be considered discretionary or variable from year to year. We initially started with just a count of how much money was spent. And the methodology, as we've been able to evolve it, will continue to become more sophisticated. But initially, it's, are we meeting the 40% spend goal? And for the most part, across the government, we are meeting that goal. As we have more time in the programs and more data in the programs, we will be able to talk about the allocation of benefits specifically. So that's a really long way of saying it's not so much as a moving target, but an evolving measure, or it's an evolving methodology of measurement. And there are certain programs across the breadth of the federal government that are a lot easier to measure than others. So when we talk about expenditures in our air quality program, generally those resources are already going towards disadvantaged communities, because you're thinking of, in the United States, we have a concept called state implementation plans, where if a country has, if a state has a higher than normally allowable amount of emissions, they are required to come up with a plan by which they can come into compliance. Generally, states are already spending their resources that they generate themselves and that we grant to them as a federal government. They're generally already spending those resources in communities that are historically disadvantaged because of concentration of industry. But when you're talking about like water quality programs, the benefits are a little more diffuse because water touches so many different spaces. So it's an evolving mechanism, and the answer will be different for every program. There will be some common methodologies, but the tools that we have, I breezed through this because I wanted to save time for questions, but we have a tool called CGIS that we use in order to map. But we also have several other mapping tools throughout EPA, and one of them is the one that my administration holds called EJ Screen. And EJ Screen allows you to identify environmental justice communities over a host of risk factors. And CGIS is more of a tracking tool that we use to sort of allocate, well, this project is in this census tract, so we can say that we spent the money here. And for reporting, CGIS is incredibly useful. But if we're talking about the identification of of environmental justice communities. We have several other tools that we use in coordination with CJIS to identify where these communities lay.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim. Any other quick questions? If not, we'll move to the next example. Happy to give the floor to Dominique Hervé. Oops, sorry. Yeah, for Chile, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to participate in this conference. I will speak about the case of Chile, how we understand environmental justice in Chile. So first of all, I want to identify three main environmental justice problems that we have in Chile. The first one is the disproportionate or unequal distribution of environmental burdens that we represent or can be represented by this concept, the sacrifice zones. I will talk more about that. The second environmental justice problem that I can identify is the disproportionate or unequal distribution of environmental benefits that can be represented with the limited access to water or the use of water and other natural resources in Chile. And the third one is the weakness of public participation in environmental decision-making. So sacrifice zones, what are sacrifice zones? These are heavily degraded territories due to pollution activities that have concentrated in a certain area. And usually these areas are industrial areas mixed with residential areas, with people that really can't afford to move from these zones. So sacrifice zones is not a legal concept. They call themselves sacrifice zones. And these are basically areas that have been growing for the last 5 decades because of Chilean economic growth and based on the exploitation of mining, copper mining, basically. So these areas are have smelters, port infrastructure, and fuel storage installations, and a lot of atmospheric pollution, soil pollution, marine pollution. So quality of life and the quality of the environment has degraded heavily in these areas. Regarding the problem of the distribution of environmental benefits, the access and use of water has become a very important conflict, environmental conflict in Chile. And this has to do basically because of the allocation of rights of access to natural resources. This in a legal system is given by ownership rights, basically either public or private ownership rights. And in Chile, the general rule is private property. So natural resources, if nothing is said, are private property. We have a special rule that says that water and mines and coastline are public domain assets. But we also have a rule that the state can grant concessions to private parties over these resources, and there's private property over these concessions. So what has been argued is that natural resources in Chile have been privatized with the conflict that this, with the consequence of this issue, which means that public don't have access or free access to these public owned natural resources. And then public participation in environmental decision-making can be analyzed basically in 2 different processes. One is environmental impact assessment, and the other one is the definition of the uses of natural resources. The first one, there is a specific space for public participation, but it is weak because it comes late. So there's actually no real incidence in decision-making, in the key aspects of decision-making. And then the second one, usually there's no intervention of civil society for determining the uses of natural resources. This is basically determined by the private party who owns the concession or the permit to use these natural resources. So there are problems regarding the design of governance for the use of natural resources. So this I would identify as the main environmental justice problems in Chile, and I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the idea and the concept and the dimensions of environmental justice in Chile, because I think that this idea is evolving in Chile from just a concept to a legal principle. And I think that you can argue that because you can find several environmental justice rules and guidelines in environmental law and policy in Chile in different legal processes that I will try to talk about a little bit. First of all, we had a constitutional debate in Chile for the last 4 or 5 years, which ended last year. And I would say environmental justice was a key issue in this constitutional debate. There was a first constitutional process, which was led by a constitutional convention, which drafted a proposal of a new constitution, where environmental justice was, I would say, a cross-cutting issue in this proposal, because its supporters would think that environmental protection did not only have to be protected by a fundamental right, but also this fundamental right to environmental protection should be consistent with economic and social rights, and with property, and with democracy, and with decentralization. So there was a lot of issues in the proposal of the new constitution that had to do with the different dimensions of environmental justice. And the draft proposed that environmental justice should be a constitutional principle. So it was included as a constitutional principle. This proposal was rejected. I don't think because of this, because there were many other issues involved. And then we started a second constitutional process, which in 2023 drafted a second new proposal of a constitution by an experts commission, which was constituted by a very different kind of political representation. But, and this is the important thing, they also included environmental justice as a constitutional mandate. So even though that was rejected as well, and now we don't have a new constitution, I think environmental justice became a very important idea in the political public debate in Chile. So another important legal process we had in Chile was the enactment of a climate change framework law in 2022, which expressly included an equity and climate justice principle, defined as it is the transcript in the slide, and also a citizenship participation principle. So I would say this legal framework law, this framework law includes every dimension of environmental justice expressly as a legal principle and mandate regarding climate change in Chile. Also in the policy, environmental policy or policy in general, there has been an important debate regarding environmental justice, which has been channeled through the just transition concept, which has to do basically with the decarbonization process Chile is in, because we have to be carbon neutral for 2050. So there's a lot of effort for new industries in order to decarbonize the energy sector in Chile. Especially lithium and green hydrogen have been promoted by the government during the last years. And this has been very contentious because not necessarily there have been included the different dimensions of environmental justice in the elaboration of this policy in Chile. So it has been criticized in a way and also defended because it has or not included these different dimensions of environmental justice. So we have all these legal or policy processes going on in Chile where environmental justice and the different dimensions are being important and discussed. But we also have some examples of current environmental law and policy, which include rules and guidelines for the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, and also for public participation. And I just want to give some examples of these rules and guidelines in order to understand that we are in the process, I think, of making environmental justice part of a legal standard in Chile. So for example, there's a policy, this is policy program, which is called Program for Environmental and Social Recovery, Programa para la Recuperación Ambiental y Social for the Sacrifice Zones, which are in place since 2017. This program means that you have to coordinate all the public authorities that have competence in these territories in order to make commitments and measures to improve the quality of life and the quality of the environment in these areas. And this program is highly participatory. So the people from the territory participate in defining which measures should be adopted in order to recover the territory which has been degraded, environmentally degraded. So that is one example. You can criticize if it has been well implemented or not, but it has been a decision of environmental policy to include this kind of measure. Also, we have strategic environmental assessment since 2015 for land use plans, which allows to include the distribution of environmental burdens in planning the land use of the basically urban territory, not rural territory. Also, we have a legal reform proposal this year, which wants to include in the environmental impact assessment the assessment of cumulative and synergistic impact, so it can be assessed the concentration of activities in a certain territory. This is still a proposal, but it's being discussed at the parliament. And also regarding environmental enforcement, for example, we have already guidelines for prioritizing inspection in vulnerable territories. So the enforcement agency has to do that. And there's a proposal for including additionality in compliance plans, which means that compliance should go beyond just fulfilling the norm, but that it has to go to include some kind of compensation for infractions. Some examples regarding distribution of environmental benefits in Chilean domestic environmental law. We have a very important reform of the Water Code in 2022, which included priority use, certain priority uses for water, which limits the water rights which have been granted on private property. And that priority uses are human consumption and ecosystem preservation. So this actually, I think, is a very strong environmental justice rule that has been included in the Water Code in Chile just recently. Another good example, which means also recognition, is the areas set aside for special indigenous uses of natural resources, which we call indigenous coastal marine spaces since 2008. And this means that certain territories can be declared these indigenous coastal marine spaces. So the indigenous communities living there can have priority use for the natural resources in these areas. Also, we have for a long time an area of the sea set aside for artisanal fishing, which also makes priority the fishing of certain communities, traditional communities that live from fishing activities. So these also, I think, are good examples of current environmental justice rules in Chile. And finally, some examples for participation in environmental decision-making in Chilean environmental law. We just ratified the Escazú Agreement 2 years ago. And so that's strengthening the legal basis for environmental participation in decision-making, which allows now to have a legal reform project in the parliament in order to modify the environmental impact assessment system. For example, establishing previous and anticipatory participation for communities and the obligation for the private party that is proposing a project to propose alternatives. So then there would be a more substantive debate regarding environmental impact assessment. We also have indigenous consultation in Chile since 2013, which not without problems has been implemented for the last 10 years in Chile, and I think is also a good example of environmental justice. So finally, some conclusions. As I said, environmental justice in Chile is evolving from an idea to a legal standard through different legal processes that I have tried to mention here. Even though environmental regulations do not often include rules that care for the problems of unfair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits between communities and relevant stakeholders, recognition of vulnerable communities or meaningful involvement, and the definition of natural resources uses are determined without an environmental governance model, which includes coordination between relevant stakeholders and equity in allocation. Even though I still think there are some examples of environmental justice rules and guidelines that can be identified in Chilean environmental law and policy that consider its different dimensions, and therefore environmental law in Chile is in the process of establishing an obligation to include certain rules that consider environmental justice elements and apply to the environment and natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for sharing the specific case. Again, it's an example really how it's very location and country specific, how there's access to natural resources and how certain communities like indigenous communities, their involvement or lack thereof being addressed through constitutional, legislative, and policy response to that, but still work in progress. Great. Any quick questions to Dominique on her specific case of Chile? And yes, Canada, please. And I also understand there may be some questions from the online participants, which I had missed earlier. So we pay attention to that. Thanks. Canada, please.
I wasn't sure if you could speak a little bit more about the prioritization of enforcement efforts. Might be too technical of a question, but I was really interested in that piece. Thank you.
Yes. The enforcement agency has established some guidelines to prioritize resources for inspection in certain territories which have been identified as vulnerable territories of communities with vulnerable conditions. So as resources are scarce, they have to prioritize where to inspect. And these are in the guidelines, the prioritization is to go to these territories where there are vulnerable communities. So that is already in place. And the other rule that I mentioned was additionality in compliance plans. That is a proposal for legal reform, which includes additionality in compliance plans in order to oblige the one who has infringed the law in order to come back to compliance. It's not only to come back to compliance, you have to go beyond that and give some compensation because of the effects of what you didn't comply with. I don't know if I explained it well.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Seeing none, maybe we can pass on now to Peter to hear about South Africa. Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you kindly, and good morning to everybody. And thank you very much to the organizers for facilitating my participation in this really important event. I'm worried that I may be bring down the tone slightly, because South Africa has huge ambitious ideas with no money. So, which is often different for the OECD countries. But I'm hoping that this will give you some insights into the how South Africa has dealt with environmental justice over time. So I'm going to quickly give you a contextual introduction to environmental justice in South Africa. Then looking at some of the environmental justice milestones, policy and legislation, the implementation and enforcement elements, some challenges, and then some concluding thoughts as well on this. So to set the context, and just based, sort of inspired by yesterday's Bhopal presentation, where an actual case study is just so powerful, I thought I'd just use a typical example of a South African town. This is the town of Sasolburg. It's 80 kilometers south of Johannesburg. It was established in 1954 to basically house the workers of a plant called Sasol. And Sasol was the South African oil from coal plant that was set up during apartheid to try and make South Africa as energy self-sufficient as possible. And because of international sanctions and what have you, this was a hugely important project prioritized by the apartheid government. So Sasol, that's an aerial photograph of Sasol in 1985. And it really is a typical blueprint of environmental racism and environmental injustice. And I'll show you how. So the top green area was, and I'm going to use the sort of racial terms because of the apartheid history that we have, but it was basically African, sort of affluent white areas, basically housing managers and executives that worked at Sasol. Then you had this kind of middle working class area, also white technicians, white middle managers, and what have you. Then the center part of the town was really heavy petrochemical industry, and the darker blue is coal mining. And then that's where you had the black township of Zamdela, basically where black people and the workers would stay. And that was a photograph, as you can see, as Zamdela taken north, looking across Zamdela towards Sasol. From that windrose, you can see that the prevailing wind is a northerly wind. And that northerly wind, especially in winter, is part of temperature inversions as well. And temperature inversions, as most of you will know, trap air pollution at low levels in the breathing zone. So it's not a hard sell to sort of say this was a classic case of environmental racism. Basically, black, poor people were just exposed to some of the worst chemical pollution you've seen. In that photograph, none of that stuff you're seeing there is steam. That is all particulate matter and volatile organic compounds, carcinogenic pollutants. So with that kind of gross level of environmental racism and environmental injustice, it's not surprising that we kind of started our environmental justice journey relatively early. And so some of the milestones are, first of all, in the late 80s, inspired by the US environmental justice movement and also the rise of the Green Party in Germany, a radical environmental group was started in South Africa. Basically, it became a home to a whole bunch of anti-apartheid activists who had no place to go because their organizations had all been banned. And because it was a green organization rather than an anti-apartheid organization, the government seemed to put up with it. And so it coined the whole and pushed the entire process of environmental justice in South Africa. But by 1992, with the release of Nelson Mandela, the unbanning of the ANC, and a whole bunch of liberation movements and what have you, Earthlife, as basically a white middle-class organization, needed to reassess where it stood in the country. And it organized this Environmental International Conference, which involved 15 countries and included in the International Labour Organization, representatives from around the world, from a whole bunch of grassroots environmental groups, for example, and a whole bunch of doyens of the movement at the time, Vandana Shiva from India, and so on and so forth. And out of this came a thing called the Environmental Justice Networking Forum, which grew dramatically. Within months of its establishment, it had over 250 organizations as members around the country. And those organizations ranged from large trade union organizations all the way down to small rural women's sewing groups. And so there's this amazing representation of people in the Environmental Justice Networking Forum. Just a point on the Earthlife stuff as well, and that stuff as well. Earthlife was formed at the University of Johannesburg. It was all kids who used to glue themselves to roads, and most of them are privileged. But even if you're privileged, you know what justice is about. Hopefully you do. So, and that's where it comes from. So within that sort of situation is that the grassroots movement within South Africa also influenced the liberation movement. And the ANC, who became the ruling party, had environmental justice in their Reconstruction and Development Program. That importantly led to the inclusion of an environmental right in South Africa's constitution. And I'll unpack that a little later. But in 1998, we had the environmental management policy and the regulation that codified that policy into law. And that specifically identifies and defines environmental justice. And then this last one, which my colleagues would probably throw things at me about and actually mentioning, is an NGO that was formed called the Center for Environmental Rights. Civil society organization staffed by a whole bunch of activist lawyers who work on behalf of communities, who have basically successfully taken my department to court on many, many, many occasions. Hence the reason my colleagues would be too pleased for me to include it as a milestone, but it is, of course, really, really important. So in terms of our constitution, we have an environmental right, and that's that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to health and well-being. And it's a multi-generational right as well. This environment is for this generation and for future generations as well. The policy that came after the Constitution defined environmental justice as a principle, rather inelegantly and clumsily, but that was better. It was better phrased in the law that followed, which was the National Environmental Management Act, which said that environmental justice must be pursued so that adverse environmental impacts shall not be distributed in such a manner as to unfairly discriminate against any person, particularly vulnerable and disadvantaged persons. And this has been tested continuously. So in terms of the implementation of the policy and legislation, South Africa's tragic apartheid history has left spatial, racial injustice. It's just the legacy of the country that we're in. So the town of Sasolburg, unfortunately, is not the only one that looks like that. In fact, every single town that has an industrial component looks like that. So as our national development plan says, is that the apartheid legacy of the spatial divide continues to dominate the landscape. But the important point here is that that's not the problem. It's not the people that are the problem. It's the polluters that are the problem. And you'll see in my concluding slides that this is something that we often just forget about as well, that what we should do is move the people rather than clean up the industries. So for many South Africans, they still predominantly Black urban communities continue to be downwind of some really important polluting activities and industries. And so therefore, a lot of the work within our national development plan around reversing the spatial effects of apartheid also are environmental justice issues as well. From a regulatory perspective though, in terms of our law, all significant developments require an environmental impact assessment, and the environmental impact assessment has to take into account the principle of environmental justice. The EIA process in South Africa is also one of the most highly participatory processes as well. And as you'll see from the court case that I'm going to show you, that's where we always lose. That we ignore the participatory elements of this. We don't pay enough attention to them at all. So this is the watchdog, and this is the strongest element of our environmental justice is a empowered, interested, an active civil society that has organizations that actually deal with these sort of things. So this Center for Environmental Rights, as you can see from this particular case, was the deadly air case where government was taken to court and accused of not providing for the rights of the people in that area to air that was not harmful to health and well-being. They won the case. And so they should have. The air in that area is terrible. But within that sort of situation, it's also incredibly difficult in a country where you're sitting with 36% unemployment. And so big industries can actually hide behind the fact that if we really start coming down on them, they'll close. And so there's that real dynamic around trade-offs. And unfortunately, in all of these kind of trade-offs, it's normally the people that are the victims of environmental injustice who have to take the biggest burden. But apart from that, we do have a whole bunch of regulatory tools that we have developed and are very, very useful. The screening tool that we use uses over 130 layers of environmental sensitivity data to screen every single application, EIA application. So before you actually submit an EIA application in South Africa, you have to go to the web-based screening tool and put your footprint on the screening tool, and it'll tell you what kind of sensitivities they are. This screening tool now is being developed to have entire layers around climate risk, so we can actually take into account things like potential flooding, coastal erosion, and so on and so forth. We have the South African Air Quality Information System app. So on South Africans' phones, you just open your app and you can see exactly what your air quality is in your region. I specifically chose this particular screenshot from the 20th of May, which shows that Zamdela Township in Sasolburg actually had pretty clean air at this particular time, which is great. But this is also one of the things that we've also seen is that South Africans, only about 20% of South Africans have laptop computers or computers and access to the internet, but over 80% of South Africans have cell phones. So the whole sort of provision of information in ways that are accessible are hugely important for us. Then in terms of the impact of these things, this is just an indication of that's the respiratory deaths per 100,000 people in South Africa. And as you can see, they kind of peaked at the time when we introduced the new atmospheric air quality the new Air Quality Act. And that new Air Quality Act replaced a piece of legislation from 1965, which was basically an end of pipe solution thing. And the new Air Quality Act is around ambient air quality standards. And so if you're talking about standards for ambient air, it means it applies to everybody. And so it's basically an act that was driven by environmental justice. And you can see the implications of that. We've created a particular indicator called the National Air Quality Index to be a proxy measure, which is based on the actual measurements of air quality. And so it's easy to understand things. So anything above 1 is increasingly unhealthy air, which means that your area is not meeting national standards. And if it's below, then of course there's increasing good quality air. That uptick in the last couple of years is because of South Africa's electricity crisis, where our coal-fired power stations have been driven beyond their capabilities. No maintenance is being done. Basically, air pollution control devices are the least of anybody's worry at this stage. And so there's been a massive increase in particulate matter from those power plants. So just to finish then, in terms of the challenges, I'm going to take you straight back to Sasolburg. And as you can see from the transition from 1985 to 2024, the footprint hasn't changed, but it has, in terms of the dynamics of that footprint, it has changed. So there's been a massive increase in, first of all, what is still a black township area. And that's because of rapid urbanization, but also the whole sort of situation of the level of joblessness in South Africa and people desperate to find work. And the reality is that once again, the unequal enforcement of legislation as well means that poor migrants coming to the area are not going to be moving into the rich areas, because of course that won't happen, or into the middle class areas. So it'll go into the poor areas. And so the expansion, as you can see from those maps, is clearly in the downwind area to Sasol. What has been reinforced though and changed slightly is that the middle class area is now more of a mixed race area. The sort of dark green area, which was basically the affluent white area, is still much an affluent white area. In fact, the whole sort of situation, I kind of laughed at the concept of green gentrification because I thought, wow, we're way away from that. But the reality is that, of course, we have it too, is that at the top of that green area is the Vaal River, which is a river. And that basically, the entire frontage has been taken up by mansions and golf courses, which means that access to that particular environmental resource for recreation and other uses is completely blocked by people that are rich and powerful. So the whole aspect of green gentrification as well also has a role to play in South Africa. So the reality is that once again, I mean, and this is, without being completely trite, is that the experience from South Africa is that effective environmental justice requires far more than progressive policy. We've got some amazing policy, which we're incredibly proud of. But the fact is that you need more than that. You need an active civil society. You need people to participate in the process. You need people to hold government to account continuously. interestingly enough, in the whole sort of situation, a transition to a low carbon society and economy is going to be incredibly important for environmental justice in South Africa. Certainly, most of our air pollution issues are related to fossil fuel burning. And so moving in that direction is hugely important. So the new developments at Sasol, for example, where Sasol is actually looking at the production of green hydrogen using wind power, is a hugely important development. But once again, it doesn't mean that in that conversion process that they can continue to pollute. So that has to be resolved. The other thing is what we're doing is that, and to me it's quite poetic almost, that coal is, instead of being used as a fuel, is now being used as a raw material for plastics and other chemicals, important chemicals as well. So suddenly, you know, the coal lobby have always said how valuable coal is, but you don't take your valuable resource and burn it, surely. So the value is really looking at a value-added industry for coal. And so that resource is being repurposed to something that hopefully is going to be really, really good. So the final thought that I'd like to share with you today is that instead of queuing to vote today, I'm sitting speaking to you. South Africa is going through its 7th democratic election today, and a hugely important time for us. But a concerning time, because although the ANC has had basically a hegemony in South Africa, political hegemony in South Africa for the last 30 years, because of 10 years of some corruption and bad performance, actually, there's a real chance that that government may change. And so the real concern amongst certainly my peer group, my friends and what have you, is that will we follow the international trend of electing governments that are rolling back on commitments to climate change mitigation, and at the same time hardening hearts and borders against the refugees that are often the victims of climate change? To me, and climate change in this regard is probably the ultimate environmental injustice. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, from, well, very, again, specific case of South Africa, from the apartheid past, and then the geographical divide that still persists, that's underlying a lot of the situation specific to your country, and also some of the examples of, you know, what's been changed, and your final thoughts. That's a big agenda. I think it's bigger than this conference, but it's an important one on the global trend and reversing some reversal that we see in green action. Any question from the floor or online to Peter? Everybody's deep in thought, digesting what we just heard. Anybody online? No, monitoring colleagues in the back? No? Yes, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I thought that was a really stimulating presentation. I'm starting to find a blurring between environmental justice and justice, and which comes first, and can you separate them? Just what are your thoughts on that, given the South African situation?
Thanks, Stephen. And that's true. You know, throughout this whole conference as well, what I thought was a very clear definition of what environmental justice is, that's actually become more and more blurry. And it really is around social justice. That's all that really is. And it's around unfair burdens on people that are vulnerable. And so, although we could use the environmental justice term, and it's a good one, and it certainly worked for us in apartheid South Africa, because basically what we were doing was we were looking at a complete social justice issue, but hiding it under a sort of an environmental flag, which kind of made it pass through the apartheid state without them recognizing that it was actually an anti-apartheid movement. So it really had its value there as well. And I think in terms of the US history of environmental justice as well, it also had a very strong racial element around looking at equal rights and these kind of sort of situations. So it had a very strong human rights basis, I think, in terms of it. But in terms of the way it's now unfolding, it's like the stage where, for example, 15, 20 years ago, we used to refer to climate change as an environmental issue. It is not an environmental issue by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that's where we are now, Stephen. I think we're in a situation where the lines are really blurring, where we are giving terms to things, where in actual fact, we're looking at basic social justice issues.
Great, thank you very much for that. That was a very good session. Now let's move on to our next speaker, Franziska, for the case of Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm feeling that I'm learning much more and will be taking home much more than I can really offer you. My division in the Federal Ministry for the Environment addresses social aspects of environmental policy. And in the German understanding, that includes, but does not fully cover, or the other way around, environmental justice issues. I'm really impressed by what I heard from the other countries. And I'm afraid in Germany, the issue is not as high profile as it seems to be in most of your countries. But still, let me run you through the German situation. Oops, sorry, that was too fast. This kind of sums up the main dimensions of environmental justice as we understand it in Germany, and probably I should say in the German Environmental Ministry, because we don't have a government-wide definition of environmental justice. So we're talking about unequal social distribution of environmental burdens, such as noise caused by traffic, or resources such as green spaces and the resulting health effects. So this is a definition shared by the Environmental Ministry, our environmental agency, and also one of the most important advisory councils of the government. So while this is not codified anywhere, so we don't have a law which defines it, this is the general understanding. In terms of vulnerability, that is defined on a case-by-case basis, if at all, I have to say. An example is the new heat protection plan, which lists, it enumerates as examples the following groups, saying the elderly, children, people with pre-existing conditions, people in need of care, people living alone, people with disabilities, homeless people. Funnily enough, it doesn't mention households with a low socioeconomic status, which also are more affected by heat and have less access to cool and green spaces. So that is not part of, it is, I mean, it is an exemplary enumeration, but still it's kind of a bit weird. So in Germany, the whole issue of environmental justice is not related to indigenous groups, to post-colonial constellations. We don't have sacrifice zones, as we heard of Chile. The main environmental justice problems are air pollution and noise, both mostly related to traffic, to roads, to airports. Not so much to like polluting industry. We managed to shift those to poorer countries, which also is an environmental justice issue. And as I said, access to green spaces and also water, like blue infrastructures, not drinking water. So that is the kind of in the narrow understanding of environmental justice, if we understand as environmental justice, but there is a wider context, a wider debate which addresses socially just environmental and climate policy. So for example, in the context of the energy transition, the government has introduced an income-related bonus in public funding for sustainable heating systems in residential buildings. That was part of an important policy project that was really difficult because the financial implications for households are relatively drastic, and the government had difficulties to explain how people with low economic status should should really replace their heating systems in an adequate way without getting poor over it. So that was a relatively dramatic debate in Germany. Apart from designing environmental and climate policy in a socially just way, we have a debate on the social ecological transformation. It's a concept that combines the social and the environmental perspective. We also have the just transition debate, but that is kind of spilling over from the European level. Of course, we have a lot of legislation that actually implements the Aarhus Convention. So we're having information rights, access to justice, participation rights, etc. But also, to be honest, we have a big debate about cutting red tape, accelerating planning, etc. This is related to energy infrastructures, both environment, regenerative energy infrastructures, but also LNG terminals, etc. In the wake of, in the aftermath of the energy crisis related to the war against Ukraine. So that led to a number of not so nice developments where the periods for public display of planning documents, the periods of participations have been shortened, plan approval requirements have been scrapped, the need for public hearings has been dropped, etc. So that's kind of rolled back. Germany acts within a strong multi-level governance system. We have the EU level, we have the federal level, we have the level of our states, Bundesländer, and we have the local level. So environmental justice kind of is tied to all of those levels, and I'll run you through these levels briefly. At the EU level, we have a similar kind of differentiation between environmental justice focusing on unequal exposure to pollution, to climate change impacts, etc., and the health effects of that. So there's a number of pollution-related EU directives that require member states to take action, like the noise and air directives. An example is the national noise action plans that need to be developed until July of this year. So, and in Germany, we found that agglomerations and major responsible entities for major roads, railways, and airports, they have to provide noise action plans. We found that 16 million people in Germany are affected by road noise of above 55 decibel, which is, I think, quite a lot. So that is one of our big issues. Then at EU level, we have the related monitoring and reports. For example, the European Environmental Agency uses an environmental inequalities indicator in monitoring the 8th Environmental Action Program, where it measures the exposure to particulate matter, PM2.5, by people living in the poorest regions with those living in the wealthiest regions. And that's the little diagram on the right side. And you can see that those, the poorest quintile and the wealthiest quintile, those lines do not really come closer to each other. So the gap is not being closed. There's the wider debate here again. We've got the European Green Deal, which has one of its goals is to leave no person and no place left behind. So environmental justice issues are frequently framed in terms of just transition here. We have the 8th Environmental Action Program, which specifies that its aim is to accelerate the green transition in a just, equitable, and inclusive way. We have a number of instruments with a special focus on regions and social groups that are disproportionately affected by the green transition, such as the Just Transition Mechanism and the Just Transition Fund, but also the Social Climate Fund. We have an EU urban agenda, which links environmental health needs with social issues, such as climate adaptation, urban mobility, and housing. And then again, we have got the whole set of legislation implementing the Aarhus Convention. So that is the European, run through the European landscape, so to speak. At the German federal level, we have no overall strategy on environmental justice. We have no office for environmental justice either. The Federal Chancellery is coordinating the German Sustainable Development Strategy, and in its latest version, which is still a draft, we're quite proud and happy that environmental justice plays a rather prominent role, prominent compared to the current German Sustainable Development Strategy. So hopefully, I mean, it is not yet adopted. We're just entering the phase of public comment. But we hope that we can keep this strong wording and this kind of governmental wide approach here, because otherwise it's all sectoral stuff. I'll tell you about the Ministry of Environment a bit later, but just to mention, there's also responsibilities in the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, Ministry of Transport, etc. So there's stuff going on in all of those. And then again, also we have those 16 federal states. Not all of them address. Just to give you an overview, some of them are sparsely populated and rather rural, and others are densely populated, urban, and highly industrialized. So that also is a reason why not all states address environmental justice to the same extent. And those that do, often have different lead ministries, different material, focus, etc. So two of the good practices in Germany at the state level is a program, a master plan, health and environment in North Rhine-Westphalia, and the Berlin Environmental Justice Atlas. Berlin is not only our capital, but it's also formally a state. So this is why I can list it here. The little figure on the bottom right is one of the maps that is produced as part of this environmental justice atlas, where the state was looking into which not only districts, but which really small neighborhoods are affected by which environmental burdens and respectively scores high on access to green spaces, and how does that relate to the socioeconomic status of those neighborhoods. Also at state level, we have a conference of environmental ministers with a subcommittee, an ad hoc subcommittee on environmental justice. But to be honest, it's not very lively and vibrant presently. At the municipal level, we're talking about almost 11,000 municipalities. The municipal level is crucial for implementing environmental justice. We have some good practice, but also we have municipal autonomy, which is a big thing in Germany. It means that municipalities regulate matters of the local community independent within the given legal framework. And that means that the federal level cannot directly regulate municipalities in many ways. We cannot just call upon municipalities to apply environmental justice practices. This is just not possible. It would be the state level that would have more leeway, but not the federal level. So that is the overarching context. Horizontally, we have environmental justice cutting across various ministries, and in a vertical perspective, we have a fragmented governance arrangement across those different levels. The potential leeway is strategy. We have it with regard to strategy building, with regard to financing. It's no problem to offer money to municipalities, but we can't regulate them. And we can influence framework provisions, notably regarding planning or construction or pollution control legislation. So those would be the areas relevant for environmental justice. But then again, let me get back to this picture. Whoops. Many of the other ministries aren't just so keen on it. So the Ministry for Transport, for example, and also the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development, they wouldn't follow all the ideas that we might have. So now I'm talking about what the environmental ministry itself can do, and we have integrated environmental justice concerns into our climate adaptation law. The aim of the law is to prevent increasing social inequalities that result from climate change. There's also the need to identify vulnerable groups for the national climate adaptation strategy, which will need to be developed in the next year. And there's an interesting funding scheme, which is called Climate Adaptation in Social Institutions. And that means that organizations in the health, the care and the social sectors that have target groups, including at least 70% of vulnerable persons. Don't ask me how they're counting those, but they're eligible to fund the development of sustainable climate adaptation concepts, to implement adaptation measures, and also to install and fund climate adaptation offices in those sectors of the social economy. In the past years, we've funded almost 400 projects under that admittedly relatively small funding scheme. To date, it's almost 62 million euro that were spent on this. With regard to urban green spaces, the term is urban. We're the national level. You can immediately understand where the problem lies, but funding is of course possible. We have a big funding program on natural climate protections or nature-based solutions, and a small sub-program, or rather two sub-programs exist that support local authorities in switching to near natural municipal green space management, planting trees, creating or improving natural oases, etc. So this is just a little slice in the bigger program that specifically addresses municipalities. There's no specific environmental justice requirement here, so there's no need to specifically address disadvantaged communities. But we assume, and we're going to look into this more deeply, that it will, of course, cover also disadvantaged communities, because those are the ones that, from an ecological perspective, also have the greatest need. So it will have co-benefits. In the new national biodiversity, which is still under development and not yet even in the interdepartmental coordination, there is a planned area of activity relating to cities and settlements, and also to health, and a potential target of the strategy that is being discussed is the walkable green accessibility in cities for 19% of the population by 2030. So that would mean that we get an indicator that operationalizes green space accessibility for different neighborhoods. Hopefully we'll get that. And the final slide on EJ activities in our remit is the toolbox that was mentioned yesterday already, which was actually a result of a research project, but it is quite well known and used by many municipalities. We do plan to develop guidelines for environmental justice. So that is the kind of task for the next couple of months. One of the not yet fully clarified questions is whether those should address federal, states, and municipalities only, or might also address the federal level, which would then mean we needed to engage with ministries that are less open to that question. I mean, you might be aware that we've got a three-party coalition with relatively different ideas relating to a lot of things. So then we've got, of course, dissemination activities. We've got regular conferences, and there's a lot of research going on. I'd like to point out the German Environmental Survey on Health, which exists since 1985, and the most recent of those surveys is just in place and at the moment. It links environmental health risks and health promoting environmental factors such as the use and perceived quality of green spaces in residential environment in conjunction with socioeconomic data. It includes about 1,500 participants, adults, after we've had 2 surveys on children and teenagers in the past years. There's also a range of BMU funded, well, environmental ministry funded projects on EJ best practice at local level, EJ opportunities at federal level, the social dimensions of climate adaptation, sustainable mobility, and resilient urban spaces, and also orientation values for public green spaces. So that is also, there is stuff happening at the research level that hopefully will then filter into the policy level as well. So coming back to the questions posed by the organizers of that conference, what worked well, what lessons are transferable, etc. First of all, the integrated approach of environmental justice has been gaining attention in Germany, both in politics, research, and practice over the past, I'd say probably 3 decades, but it's not really soaring high. So implementation could be more ambitious at the different levels, different administrative levels. We have problems here partly due to the distribution of competences that I pointed out, and lack of competences at federal level, but the federal level can support the implementation of environmental justice in various ways, of course. So what worked well, that's probably different at the different administrative levels, and it's much easier to specify where the challenges are. And this is clearly interdepartmental cooperation. I'd be interested in learning from the other countries whether that is the case in your countries as well. Concerning the transferability of lessons, from what I heard yesterday and also now, I think lessons will be transferable to the extent that the understandings we have of environmental justice are similar, because we might talk of completely different things, and also the implementation contexts are similar. So I think instruments, for example, and tools, etc., that would be really interesting to learn what others are doing, but it needs to fit to the understanding that we have in our country. Otherwise, I can't take it up. How can the OECD advance the agenda was the final question. And I'd like to say a big thank you for already doing that. You are already advancing the agenda with this event and with the publications that you presented yesterday, and that I found really, really interesting and helpful. What else could you do? Of course, collating evidence of environmental injustice across the OECD would be really interesting, kind of stacking up all that stuff and making it plain to the rest of the world that we have a problem. Also, data on who is vulnerable with regard to which exact environmental problem would be helpful. But we shouldn't only make clear we have a problem, we also have solutions. So sharing good practice examples of environmental justice policies, as we are doing now, looking into the different political, institutional, cultural aspects related to that. I'd also be open to, well, looking into success factors and obstacles, possibly formulate policy recommendations, guiding principles, maybe more technical specifications as well, because that is what municipalities call for. They say, well, we need to have it really, really concrete. And this would rather be more the technical specification. About widening the focus, I said Germany has this kind of narrow focus when talking about environmental justice, and I think the other aspects are really, really important too. We also cover them in Germany, like the costs of environmental policy, the whole Aarhus set of policies, and just transition. My kind of plea would be, we need to consider that those are very different challenges related to those other dimensions that are included in the environmental justice concept in other countries, not in Germany. Very different challenges, and some of them are addressed at very different policy levels. So environmental justice, to a large degree, at least in Germany, is a local issue, whereas policy costs of environmental policy is a national level issue. So I'm a bit split-minded about how we can all bring this together. Final slide, sorry, then I'm silent. I think we also need to work on the narrative a little bit and stress some aspects that tend to be neglected. Being environmental policy is a driver of justice in its own right. Clean air, clean water, noise abatement, etc. Even energy efficient household appliances, they all ease burdens, especially for vulnerable households. We have to acknowledge that green transformation still comes at a cost. Let's not burden those that have the least means to really carry the costs. But I'd also point out, what does the polluter pays principle means in that context? And for me, that means that those causing the lion's share of environmental impacts, and that those are mostly, at least in Germany, the affluent households, they should contribute more to financing the green transition. So from the perspective of Germany, there is, those are aspects that I would like to bring into the debate here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for sharing what's happening also at the EU level, but also within Germany, and your frank assessment of the challenges of the different levels, federal, vertical, but also horizontal, and also for some suggestions which I think will be addressed in the following session. So any quick question to Francesca? Yes, the lady in the back.
Hi, sir. I had a question for the whole panel. I don't know if you want me to wait or.
Yeah, if you could hold your thought, because then we're going to come back to the Q&A session where we're going to have open discussion. And also we have some more general questions from online. EB, do you have a question to Francesca?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Francesca Carlson from the European Environmental Bureau. Thank you all to the panelists for your presentations. They were really interesting. I have a question for Franziska. I listened very carefully to sort of the German concept and idea of environmental justice, and essentially how the policy and the legislation as it's implemented and perceived in Germany looks at environmental justice from a very sort of environmental pure perspective. But I welcome in any case what you said, that there is some effort to maybe come up with guidelines on environmental justice that would, I hope, also include the engagement of federal ministries. I say this in particular with regards to very recent developments that are very concerning, I would say, of environmental and climate activists now being prosecuted for claiming that they're forming criminal organizations. And I think that these 2 days have definitely demonstrated that environmental justice is not just an environmental issue, but is intrinsically linked to justice and human rights. So I appreciate the sort of very technical difficulties that the German ministry might face in coming up with guidelines for environmental justice. But I do wonder what efforts are being taken in Germany as a whole at all levels to ensure that environmental justice is as broadly understood as possible to ensure that human rights are actually protected and that we're not backsliding on the rights that we take for granted, especially in the EU and in Germany. Thank you.
What efforts are taken to ensure that environmental justice is defined as broadly as possible? I'm not sure I share that concern. I'm absolutely convinced that we need to address all the different aspects of environmental justice that are theoretically part of the concept, but that in Germany are not part of the concept. Like the Aarhus pillars, I mean, that might still come in, but costs of environmental policy is an aspect that in Germany is not addressed under the heading of environmental justice, because that debate focuses on health-related issues like risks and opportunities relating to the exposure to pollution, heat, etc., and the resulting health effects. So I think it's important to cover the different aspects, the different dimensions. I'm not sure how important it is to reframe a concept that has gained some visibility in a country and is understood more narrow than it is here. Do you understand what I mean? I'm not neglecting the need to address, for example, distributive effects of climate policies. I think it's a very important starting point to raise the attention relating to that. It's within Germany, it's just not part of the environmental justice debate, which is due to kind of sort of a tradition that we have, and that tradition focuses on the health effects and not on the monetary implications. So I'm not sure how to deal with it. If we start to kind of reframe the concept, that implies a lot of confusion. So I'm still thinking maybe we just follow those different concepts. I mentioned earlier that my division is responsible for social aspects of environmental policy. So in my very division, we are addressing those other aspects. For example, regressive effects of environmental policies. We just don't do it under that term, environmental justice.
Thank you very much. Okay. Let us now move to, so thanks to all the panelists, and we're going to come back to a general panel discussion. Before that, I would like to just open the floor if any additional countries would like to share your national experience in addition to the 4 country cases we heard. And I understand that there is going to be Israel, I think joining online, or is it Adam? No, joining online. Yes, okay. So I would like to add a 5th country now. I don't have actually the name of the presenter, but voila, now we see it. So you have the floor, Israel.
Thank you very much. So my name is Tzachor Gidron. I'm from the Israeli Ministry of Environmental Protection. I'm coordinating a project dealing with the designing policy for a just transition. And first of all, I want to thank you for the interesting and very important conference, and for the opportunity to share with you our experience regarding the aspect of paying attention to the distributional angle of the cost of the environmental policy. Actually, I think in a similar way to the German speaker, Israel actually doesn't have yet a comprehensive EJ approach or national approach, but there are fragmentic implementation of such principles in several policies and actions. And the process that we are going to share with you is one of them. Before I leave the floor to Dr. Platnik to elaborate a little bit about the research he held, I want to describe the process this research was part of. Although the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel has no authority in occupational matters and employee-employers relationship, we conducted a just transition design policy think tank, inviting all stakeholders from relevant ministries, trade unions, employers, and other NGOs delegates. The objective of the process was to anticipate the potential impacts of environmental economy, transitional policy, and policy tools, especially carbon taxation, on employees and employment, and to do that in advance, including from a geographical perspective, and also from the adaptation point of view of I forget the word right now, but all of those was done in order to promote the design of a just transition policy and focus the efforts of designing policy tools to the most vulnerable areas and to accurate them. So now I leave the floor to Dr. Platnik to show the research.
Thank you, Zafrir, and thank you for the opportunity to present our research here. So the quick question that we were asked by the Ministry of Environmental Protection was to assess the impact of potential carbon tax on the labor market in Israel. And we were a group of researchers facilitated by the Institute of Democracy in Israel that conducted this research. Please continue to the next slide. Okay, thank you. I will briefly discuss the methodology that we used here. We employed the computable general equilibrium model for the Israeli economy, that is characterized as a small open economy with 5 energy sectors, water sector, and other sectors of the economy aggregated according to their energy intensity. For the analysis of just transition, the labor market was modeled for a high-skilled and low-skilled labor. The model was calibrated to the actual data of 2014. This is the latest input-output tables that are available for Israel. Now the counterfactual analysis simulated carbon tax levied on all energy sources according to their carbon content. The tax ranges from 14 to 110 US dollars. And the income that this new tax generates to the government is recycled in the model to keep the public budget neutral. Please continue to the next slide. Here we see the results for the simulation of the carbon tax of 150 shekels per ton, which is around 40 US dollars. And the tax revenue is transferred to the households. This analysis is the closest to the carbon tax that is currently proposed in the government budget. As expected, the carbon tax primarily impacts energy sectors and energy-intensive industries. In these sectors, the tax causes an increase in price and their input is projected to decline. However, it is important to emphasize that the share of energy-intensive sectors in Israel is just 15% of the GDP. So most of the sectors in Israel are not energy-intensive, and the direct impact of carbon tax on them is negligibly negative or even positive, contributing to the growth of industries such as pharmaceutics and high-tech. In other words, carbon tax basically stimulates the economy to undergo structural changes from polluting industries to the cleaner production. Please, the next slide. Yes, the next slide. And you can click again here. Yeah, thank you. The impact on the employment reflects the changes in the sectoral production. Here you see the impact on low-skilled labor characterized by high school education or less. And on the other side, there is the impact on the employment of high-skilled labor. The employment in energy-intensive sectors is in the orange bars, and the other sectors are in the blue bars. So energy-intensive sectors primarily employ low-skilled labor. Therefore, the jobs of these workers are expected to decline. In contrast, the employment of highly skilled workers is expected to increase. So the conclusion is that it is necessary to support the mobility of low-skilled labor so they are absorbed into the cleaner sectors that are projected to expand. Next slide, please. This is the final slide where I would like to reflect on the proposed text by the government. So in the table, I show the share of social cost of carbon captured by the proposed text. When the social cost here reflects $48 US, meaning the old assessment by the EPA. And the text starts from lower shares, but it is projected to increase by 2030. So for some fuels, the tax reflects the full cost of this externality. However, the tax on the main energy source in Israel, natural gas, reaches only about 30% of the social cost of carbon, and the tax does not cover most of the transport fuels at all. In addition, in order to motivate the industry to reduce emissions, the proposed tax basically gives the industry cash back, but there is this refund is not subject to any demonstration of emission reduction in practice. So to conclude, the proposed carbon tax policy in Israel, while not optimal, represents a significant first step in the right direction. It is still to be approved by the parliament, and it is subject to political tensions. So I hope it will be actually approved. Yet it is crucial to reassess the policy in the future and to enhance its effectiveness, to ensure the support for just transition, meaning support for low-skilled labor and low-income population. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing this particular case of how, environmental policy like carbon tax is affecting low-skilled workers. So it's a particular segment of a labor force or population and in different industry. And it reminds me of what Peter said earlier about, some of the policies are moving people away and not cleaning up industry. But this is an example where you can try to do both. Now, thank you very much. I would like to open the floor, and I know there are already 2 questions waiting. This lady in the back, so you go first, and then after that, I would like to take one question that's been posted online. So please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kathy, the head of responsible business with Shell. So I lead a policy and advocacy unit of experts that cover human rights, just transition, DE&I. So there are a number of these social issues that affect Shell in the energy transition. So probably a little bit like what Francesca does, except on the opposite side of the house. And I had a question just about just transition, because I think the term has been batted around quite a bit in the reports and also by the panel. And I think Shell's trying to put together its just transition strategy. So I did want to get a sense of whether there was a specific government definition that was adopted. I don't think so, but I just want to double check. And then the second part I wanted to ask about was sort of the role of the multinational. So that was one thing that was raised yesterday by the trade associations, but I think it is a question which I'd like to hear sort of directly from the governments about. Yeah, and the third part, which I think I was just discussing at coffee now, was, in Shell world, of course, there's a big focus on the environment part of the debate. We're an energy company. I get it. Fossil fuel is highly polluting. Yes. I'm on the S part of the environmental and the transition. I just want to make sure a lot of those issues are addressed by policymakers. That's a little bit of my request, but we don't hear that when we have our annual general meetings, the one on Tuesday or earlier this week. Most of the questions are on environment and not on social issues and what we're doing. And that really undermines my ability to work within the company to address these sort of D&I issues, these unjust transitions, these impacted workers. It really does affect my team's ability to enact policy in the company to make sure these things are addressed. So I guess those three kind of questions, maybe 30 seconds, quick answer would be helpful.
Thank you. Let me also, so that we can do one round of questions from the panelists, very quick one. So let me just read out one more question to add from a participant online. So he or she says, do the sophisticated mapping and data analytic tools referred to by South Africa and the US help to reduce the contestation of evidence in relation to environmental justice? So that was, the mapping tool that some of the panelists mentioned. So that's a question around that. Did you, I think Shadow wanted to add to a question of, yes, do you want to hold it or can Professor Wilson can go? Okay, yes, first.
No, actually the question, the online question was really close to my question, and it's for the US. Well, just real quickly. So we have all these mapping tools, and I'm a big fan of them. I'm also a big critic of the mapping tools. So, the question is, what's the utility of the tools from the US lessons learned, and can that be applied to other parts of the world, particularly when in some countries, you're not even collecting the vulnerability data that needs to be collected. So how can you really use these tools when you're going to actually mask and dilute the folks who need the services the most? And also, we talked a lot about cost benefit analysis. And I found it somewhat a struggle with that framing sometimes, because with communities that have been impacted by decades and decades of environmental injustice, how you're fully getting those externalities that they internalized, right? How are you really tracking that? So how are you building it into a model, and how are you ground truthing that? That's important. And just as a professorial moment, I think I'm hearing a lot of comments about, different frameworks of environmental justice. Everyone in the room should know the 17 principles of environmental justice. They were established in 1991. You can connect all the work you're doing in any part of the world to those 17 principles. So I just want to end there.
Thank you. And then last question from Shadow, and then we open for responses.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, thanks to all the panelists for the fascinating presentations you had, and your candor also in terms of the challenges. I did have one specific question for Karim, because a lot of the US effort is, a lot of the basis goes back to the executive orders, which is directing federal agencies. The question I have is, does that lead to a stop-start cycle as the administrations change, given the very big differences in policy?
Okay, there was a lot of questions, and we have maybe, a quick 1-minute response from all the panelists, starting in order. So with Karim first, and then in the order in which.
Ooh, sorry.
Please.
I don't know that I can do this in a minute, but I will try. Okay. So regarding the US definition of just transition, there's not a single definition of what it means to conduct a just transition. And we know as the United States that there is both a domestic and an international element to that. We are trying to be respectful of that discussion, and to the extent we as domestic policymakers are operating, we are focusing on what it means internally in the United States to have a just transition, because even though we consume resources from the globe generally, we still do have issues of allocation of burdens of extraction of resources domestically. The issue about social issues, or the question about social issues, I've actually been thinking that through since we discussed it in the hallway. And one of the things that I think is interesting, that when you look at domestic foreign policy discussions in the States, we actually do have an interesting dialogue around social issues. It just doesn't typically get elevated in the national political discourse. So if you're interacting with an agency, you will have several conversations with policymakers and career employees about what will be termed social issues, but it's really about the impact of policies and decisions that are being made. We are in an election year, so media availability is extremely limited. So the coverage of those discussions probably doesn't rise to the level where it would make your job any easier. And for that, I'm sorry. Evidence accessibility. So this is the online question. That varies. I'm sorry, but I don't have a quick answer for that because the admissibility of evidence varies widely. It depends on whether or not it's a civil or a criminal trial. It depends on whether or not it's a policy decision. There's variabilities in the various states, and then there's the degree to which different programs incorporate the available information into some of their permitting or policy decisions. But what I will say is this, and this actually gets to Dr. Wilson's question, is that environmental justice advocates, I think, are in a beautiful position now in that there is a tremendous amount of available data, and the opportunity you have to push on the building of models, being able to incorporate satellite data, the data that the government makes publicly available, the data that's available to through various freedom of information processes through the various governments, puts you in a position where you don't just have to accept the model that is forwarded by the entity that's pursuing a permit. You have the ability to construct a model, and you can validate your model as an alternative interpretation of the impacts and available data. So I think as we move forward, because remember, we are in a relatively early phase of public availability of data. This is a relatively new model, and being able to have the sort of analytical framework and analytical power in environmental justice communities to be able to get the data, analyze the data, and extrapolate from what that data means is a relatively new framework. So I think what you will see is more communities being able to access NGOs, volunteer organizations, volunteer resources, and being able to provide more of a scientist to scientist, policy to policy, but also being able to talk about some of the implications of some of this data in a social science way that is relatively new to decision making. And then finally, executive orders. It's an election year, and we get this question every 4 years. What if a new person comes in? Will there be a change? I will remind people that the 1990s executive order under Clinton never went out of effect. The nature of U.S. politics is one in which there's always going to be that creative tension, both at the federal level and at the individual state levels. And we're designed that way. We're supposed to live in a state of constant tension where eventually we come to a resolution that works for the majority of the country. Sometimes we will have great leaps forward. Sometimes we'll have a little bit of a change in a direction that those of us who are more forward leaning on the environment might not prefer. But at the end of the day, we generally move towards progress. So I would say, just as our partners understand that generally we do the right thing. And I think irrespective of the concerns about what could happen in an election, the United States is still committed to the international support and the multilateral and bilateral relationships that we have with the partner OECD countries. So we expect to continue to act in that vein, and we hope you will too. Thank you.
Thanks. That was also a quick answer to what Peter had posed at the end of his presentation. Now over to Dominique, please.
Okay, regarding the just transition question, I would say in Chile, there's no single just transition definition. There is a just transition strategy for energy, which was built by the Energy Ministry. The Environmental Ministry has elaborated a socio-ecological just transition strategy, which is much broader. I would say it has more to do with environmental justice than the energy just transition. So there's no single definition of just transition. It depends on the sector you are looking at. I think that was the question for me.
Thank you. Peter?
Thank you. On the just transition one, this is an interesting one. As we were finalizing South Africa's climate change response policy in 2011, at the 11th hour, we had very strong lobbies, mostly from industry, about including the concept of just transition into the policy. At the time, we naively sort of said, well, that sounds fine, because we thought it was based on our principles of environmental justice. As it turned out, of course, there's a bit of political motive behind that, and just transition has entered our policy, although it's only mentioned 3 times in the policy. And immediately afterwards, we realized that we've been kind of duped and that justice was there for fossil fuel workers and not for everybody. We immediately pushed back against that and brought back our environmental justice concerns. And luckily our first of all, a National Planning Commission, then followed by our Presidential Climate Commission, has brought back the term to mean that environmental justice is justice for all. So it's not just for the people that may be affected by the transition in terms of fossil fuel workers, but also for the victims of climate change. It'd be a bit difficult to sort of say that fossil fuel workers have greater rights than the people that are suffering from immense climate change impacts. So hopefully that's been sorted out. And in terms of that as well, in fact, these kind of things around mapping tools, and there was one next question around these things, is that these are just really are tools. But when it comes down to actual things on the ground, you can't rely on a bunch of spatial information to provide you with that kind of access. You have to speak to people. And as Shell has found in the South African situation, when they were looking at seismic surveys at seas, indigenous communities living along the coast have the power to stop them from doing that. And it's purely around environmental justice issues. And those are all incredibly localized issues.
And Franziska?
Yeah, I'd also like to take up the just transition question. Within Germany, we lean towards taking up the European understanding of the concept, which is not fully spelled out and defined, I think. But there is a broader understanding than, I mean, the Just Transition Fund addresses sectors under the pressures of decarbonization. But the Commission, I think, has a slightly, well, not slightly, a much broader approach and looks into the fields that define the European Green Deal, such as zero pollution, circular economy, biodiversity, etc., seeing those also as transitions. And these transitions too need to be just, and that does not only apply to the economic sectors, the companies and the workers, but also to consumers and also to citizens in the sense of citoyens, political beings, and vulnerable groups. So I think that's more an understanding that we should follow, and then we avoid the problems that Luke just mentioned. No, Peter, sorry, Peter.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have had a really good, fruitful discussion for the past couple of hours, despite some hiccups at the beginning. So round of applause to our excellent panelists we just had. And now we are moving to the last and final session that will be chaired by Shadow.